Well, this morning I want to tell you, well, actually, I'm really happy you're here today because I'm going to preach to myself and you're here to hear it, okay? So you should feel, so you're listening in. You're listening in because what I have to say today, this idea of, rejoice. And again, I say rejoice. If there's anyone who needs to hear it, it's me, okay? Because to be honest with you, I'm a half full, no, a half empty sort of a guy, okay? I don't know, you want to call it realism, you want to call it pessimism, I don't know, but I tend to, and sometimes I want to chalk it up to genetics, say maybe my dad was like that, and maybe that's kind of how a farmer is sometimes. We're always talking to God about, hey, when are you going to bring the rain, Lord? When are you going to bring the temperatures? When are you going to, stop dry up the land? I mean, all these things the farmer needs to get his crops in. And so we're always, Tevye from the Fiddler on the Roof. He's always talking to the Lord. But he seemed to be kind of a pessimistic guy too. But before I get into that, but anyway, I am preaching to myself and you're here to hear it. Because if anyone needs to hear about rejoicing in the Lord, it's me. I need to have a better attitude. But before I get into that, I want to tell you about a fishing trip I had a couple years ago. Every time I tell it, the story gets better. That's how fishing trips are, huh? But I got to tell you, first off, I didn't catch the big one. Even though I was in the northern Wisconsin, and that's like called the muskie capital of the world, okay? Up there, they actually have claimed it. There's actually 2 towns up in Wisconsin that claim this idea of being the muskie capital of the world. There's Hayward, Wisconsin, and there's Boulder Junction, Wisconsin, and they've been fighting for decades trying to who is going to pull in the biggest muskie. Well, I have never caught a muskalounge in my life, okay? So I'm lucky if I get a 1-pounder or a 2-pounder, that would just thrill me, okay? So, but anyway, muskies are quite a large fish. And secondly, I need to tell you that, if it wasn't for my brother Jim, who lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I would have never gone fishing anyway, okay? But he traveled all the way to northern Wisconsin from Tulsa, Oklahoma with his truck and his boat. And he's like the Cabela outfitter, okay? So he brings all the gear and I just show up and, take the easy way. So what I'm trying to say here is I'm not much of a fisherman. Even though I enjoy fishing, I'm not that good at it. Well, to make a long story short, we went to this fishing camp, or this fishing area, and for the first 2 days, I didn't even go fishing, okay? I was too tired, so I just stayed in the cabin and slept. And that was okay, because my brother Jim, he was with a fishing guide, and the fishing guide was supposed to tell my brother where all the fish were. But that didn't turn out too well because it was too warm, and the water was too warm, and the weather was too warm, and so they didn't have any luck fishing. And so by day 3, I finally got a chance to go out fishing, and I have a good imagination of what's under the surface of the water. I think I'm going to pull in the big one because I don't know what's down there, but I'm hoping to catch something. As it turned out, we didn't catch nothing but like a small perch and a bluegill. And that was the beginning of my fishing trip. But the thing about fishermen is that's really totally against my personality, and that fishermen are optimists, okay? If there's a body of water and if they have some bait, they're optimistic. They think they're going to go out and catch something. And so on day 3, I went out with my brother again, and there was a slight breeze in the air, and that was good because that always keeps the mosquitoes away. And sometimes the mosquitoes are as big as a fish up in northern Wisconsin. But it looked like it was going to be another disappointing day. Nothing was biting. It was just like, well, what's going on here? But then all of a sudden, something happened. The wind shifted. The temperature all of a sudden dropped. The barometer dropped. The clouds started to roll in, and guess what? The fish started biting like you couldn't believe. It was a feeding frenzy, and the next thing you know, we had gotten our limit. We can only get so many, and then we had to go in. And that was okay because it was downpouring, raining by that time, and we were all soaked. And that got me thinking. We didn't change the bait. We didn't change the lures. We were still on the same body of water all those other days. What was the difference? Well, the only thing that changed was the weather. And I thought to myself, wow, if we could control the weather, the fishermen would be awesome. It'd be awesome. If someone could control the weather, that would be a powerful person indeed. But I'm thinking about a different type of a weather, not the physical weather out there. I'm actually talking about the weather in our hearts. Because we really have no control of the weather out there. It comes and it goes, the fronts come, and all we can do is talk about it and listen to it and maybe prepare for it. But what about our own personal weather pattern? It's really described as our attitude. Do you remember the cartoons of the cartoon characters that always seem to have a rain cloud over their head? There was a couple of them there. I remember there was Ziggy. I think Ziggy always had a dark cloud over his head. Eeyore from the 100-Acre Woods, Christopher Robin, he always had that, seemed like the rain cloud over his head. But that dark little rain cloud that followed these characters was symbolic, really, of the person's attitude. The pessimistic personality, the outlook on life. I chuckle at those characters because, like I said, I'm really preaching to myself here. This is me in a nutshell in some ways. I come off that way. I am more pessimistic than optimistic. I'm pretty good at finding the dark cloud around the silver lining. They say, find the silver lining in the dark cloud. No, I'm the opposite. I find the dark cloud in the silver lining sometimes. Sometimes I like to say I'm a super realist. I'm not pessimistic, I'm just a realist. So this is why when I preach from Philippians, I always hesitate to preach about the part about rejoice, Paul says. And again I say, rejoice. Because a lot of times I'm just not feeling it. And I'm not sure if I'm even feeling it now. But it wouldn't be right to preach out of Philippians and ignore this essential verses where Paul says, rejoice. Another word to say rejoice is to celebrate. We celebrate for different reasons, don't we? I celebrated a lot lately. I celebrated my son Caleb won 10U hockey tournament with his team. They held up this huge trophy. It was practically half as tall as Caleb was. They do that in hockey. They seem to have very large trophies. I rejoiced when Casey won first at the state solo ensemble just yesterday. That was terrific. I'm so happy. He's got a lot of talent there. I rejoiced when my daughter decides to go out for softball and makes the JV team. I don't think they're going to cut anybody, but she helped. But she was there because without a few extra girls, they wouldn't even had a JV team. So I rejoiced that she was willing to participate in that, even though she's not so confident about it. She's willing to be there so they could have a team. I rejoice in that sort of stuff. I rejoice that spring's around the corner. I rejoice that, someday I might get a raise. No, just kidding about that one. I got a good report from the doctor, I said spring is coming. That's always a good one. But these are all legitimate and worthwhile things to celebrate. And when it gets right down to it, they're all based on circumstances, right? Well, we put effort toward them, but they are circumstances. And that's not a bad thing. That's just the way life is. We rejoice when you hear good news. But some people even rejoice in evil. Do you know that, right? People rejoice in evil. When bad things happen to others, sometimes they rejoice, especially it seems like in politics. There's always someone there to rejoice when something happens and their reputation gets crumbled, or that's a result of our fallen nature. So we rejoice in the good things. Sometimes we rejoice, it's terrible to say, but sometimes we rejoice in the things that are not good. But when Paul speaks about rejoicing, he takes the topic to a whole new level because he's talking about rejoicing not in our circumstances, which change as quickly as the wind and the weather patterns, but in the Lord himself and his character and his nature, which never changes. Look at the list of these virtuous traits and high moral standards that, according to Paul, we are to think upon, as our scripture reading was today. We are supposed to rejoice and to aspire to nobleness and righteousness and purity and loveliness, things that are admirable, things that are excellent, things that are praiseworthy. And yet I doubt Paul would ever be satisfied if we just pursued those things and stopped there. Because really, unless our efforts to find those things or to participate in those things, if it didn't lead us to God, I'm not sure Paul would ever be happy with that. Sometimes I'm struck sometimes like in the public schools where they love to uphold those virtues, to say, hey, be good, be righteous, do this and that. But it's kind of in a vacuum. Why? Who's the source of all that? They really don't get into that. But that's not what Paul says here. He says we can go after nobleness and righteousness and purity because we know what's at the end of that, and that's God himself. So when we think about and aspire to these traits that Paul lists, we don't do them for the sake of those traits themselves, just to make us better people. But in pursuing those things honestly and truthfully, we cannot help but run smack dab into God, the source of those things. For God is the source of all goodness and righteousness and purity. He is the source of all that is admirable and excellent and praiseworthy. And so when Paul says, think about these things, in a very real sense, he says, set your hearts and mind on God, who is the author of all these things. All these things that are good. So here is Paul's first action word to help us in changing our personal weather pattern. Because sometimes we need to do that. And that is to change our own attitude. Rejoice in the Lord. And the first action is because although our attitude is personal, it's our personal, it affects so many around us, doesn't it? When our attitude is good, we affect others positively. When our attitude is negative and poor, well, it really does harm to others around us. Have you ever been around someone who seems down in the dumps, can't seem to look at the positive side of anything? Sort of like the SNL Debbie Downer. Maybe you've seen those and chuckled at those before. Everyone's having a good time, and then Debbie Downer says something. They all just, the air goes out of the room. It's quite humorous, but behind all the humor is a little bit of truth there, right? We really don't want to be around those people very long because those negative vibes will rub off on us. True, they may have legitimate complaints. And it's good for us to give them some airtime to express their grievances. That's good. But if they refuse to remove themselves from under the rain cloud, well, we'd better head for cover because we're going to get soaked with their negativity. And the opposite is true. When we have a positive attitude, well, that's going to rub off as well. We want to help others overcome their problems, don't we? We want to come alongside somebody who might have a negative outlook on life and maybe an overall poor attitude about life. And we want to help them, but sometimes we struggle in that because, quite frankly, we haven't done our own spiritual work in our lives. You know how they talk about if someone's drowning out there, be careful to go when you go in to rescue them because they can take you down with them. You got to be very careful. That's probably the first thing you learn about lifeguards. I've never been a lifeguard. I could barely swim. But if I were a lifeguard, they always tell you the first thing, be careful when you're trying to save somebody drowning. You got to do it in a proper way, or it could mean your life as well. We want to be the life preserver, but we got to be ready and do our own spiritual work in that. And so Paul says here's your spiritual work. So that not only can you help your own situation, you can help others. Listen to what Paul writes. Now this is important. In the preceding verses to the famous rejoice in the Lord, and always, again, I say rejoice, he writes this, help those women. Ha, how do you like that, all you women out there? Help these women. He's talking about a couple and he names them by name. These are a couple of women in the church at Rome or Philippi, who are not getting along. they're having a disagreement. We don't know exactly what that is, but it obviously is something significant enough that Paul would address that in the letter to the Philippians. He needs to address it. And here's the thing. These women are God-fearing, devoted Christian followers who have sacrificed greatly for the cause of Christ. They're not a couple of people who are just standing around and bored and want to stir up trouble. These are devoted, strong Christian servants. And Paul writes to them right before he says, rejoice. And again, I said rejoice. He says, help these women. These women who have contended at my side for the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. These are God-fearing people. And this goes to show us that even loyal and wholeheartedly committed Christians can find themselves at odds with one another, at odds with life itself, and need reconciliation. And the good news here is that Paul says that can happen. It can happen. He calls on the mature believers to help the situation. I ask you, loyal yoke fellow, help these women. He puts out a plea. And this really goes back to our personal weather patterns, I believe. If these people are going to help, they're going to have to check themselves, look in the mirror themselves and say, where am I at spiritually? We're in no position to help those who are at odds with one another, who are at odds with life itself, unless we've done our own spiritual homework. And that begins when he says, rejoice in the Lord. Celebrate God's loving and holy nature, desiring that for our own personal lives. Well, how do we do that? He gives us some advice. Number one, and I probably am like a broken record, but pray. Let's face it, when life throws the curveball, our immediate response isn't it anxiety? Doesn't the blood pressure shoot up? Doesn't the heart race faster? Doesn't our stomach turn in knots when we hear something that just, I just don't want that to happen? These are the symptoms of anxiety. Trust me, I know them. And Paul says, don't be anxious about anything. But in everything, pray with thanksgiving and present yourselves your request. Present your request before God. It's good to pray, but even more important, it's to know who you're praying to. Do you have any sort of personal relationship with this person that you pray to? If you don't, you got to get that figured out. Our anxiety will be relieved if our prayers ascend to the one we don't know as a stranger, but we know as a real being, a real entity, a real person. 10 people could gather around a lost child and try to comfort that child. But until the mother or the father walks in the room, they're not going to be comforted. It's a simple, they don't know these strangers, but they know their mom and dad. And that's what's going to comfort them. How are we going to change our personal weather pattern? Well, it says first rejoice, not in the changing circumstances of the world, because they're always they change like the weather. But we rejoice in the Lord who never changes. Second, we pray to the one we personally know, who personally knows us. And third, we reflect and meditate on God's perfect and holy character and nature. And when we do, we cannot help but be awed by who this God is that we serve. And four, Paul says, practice godliness. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen from me, put it into practice. I chuckled at Lily the other day. She goes, because she was on the dance team, okay? So she had done these certain exercises so she could perform her dance routine with the dance team. But all of a sudden, and she thought, well, I'm in probably pretty good shape. I could just jump into softball. All different sorts of muscles you got to use for softball. And so she's like going, why am I so sore? It's like, well, you were using different muscle groups. put it into practice. Well, you might say, well, I've never seen Paul. I don't know Paul personally. He says, imitate him. Well, I don't know about Paul. I've never seen. Well, we read about him in the New Testament, don't we? We receive from him most every time we crack open the Bible and read the New Testament, we're probably going to read something from Paul. So we have no excuses. We put into practice that. But it's like anything else. When you start practicing something new, you feel awkward at it. Ever try, maybe you haven't played golf for a while, and you go out and try to play golf. That's going to be a sight to behold, right? What if someone says, hey, could you knit me a scarf? Lynn Marta, she's wonderful at knitting, or crocheting, or knitting, but if she'll teach you how to knit, but it's going to feel very awkward at first trying to learn to put into practice this new skill. It's going to seem awkward. It's going to seem unnatural. A different set of muscles has to be used. Different focus. And in that case, it's probably very easy for us to attempt to drop the habit, to not even get a habit, just drop it. It's like, I can't do this. We need to persevere. There is great reward in perseverance when it comes to praying to God and knowing God and striving to be like Him. Because Paul writes, when you do that stuff, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and your minds in Christ. In other words, God's presence in our lives will be our new weather pattern. Remember last Sunday I talked about, make God bigger in your hearts. Well, the same idea here. God will direct your thoughts. God can direct your desires. God can shepherd you in your choice of actions in such a way that those things we're working out His will in our lives. Now, I could stop right there and say, you know what? There's plenty there to rejoice about. But we can see, because in that, we get a glimpse of God's wonderful plan for us. God's plan to help us and mold us and make us more tolerable to others. And more importantly, to just get us ready for heaven. So we could stop right there and be happy and rejoice. But God raises the stakes even more. Because in verse 7, Paul says, the peace of God will be ours. And that would be enough for me. But like God, He's always got something a little more. He's always got that little kicker at the end. And Paul gives it to us in verse 9 when he switches it around. He says, not only will we get the peace of God, you get the God of peace. He will be with you when you practice these things. So if you thought peace of God was enough, well, you're mistaken. Because the God of peace will be yours too. Isn't that just like God? Just when we think He can't give us any more, He surprises us with something even greater. As is the peace that surpasses all understanding, you think that would be enough. And He promises His very presence. And so and I believe I can, and I hope you can, because I thank you for sitting in here and listening to this sermon I'm preaching to myself. We can rejoice in the Lord always. And as Paul says, I will say it again, I can rejoice in the Lord. Because not only does He give me His peace, He has given Himself wholeheartedly and sacrificially and lovingly to me. Amen.